The ice-stone palace of the Winterclaw Kingdom was not built for comfort. It was built for endurance. And tonight, kneeling on the unforgiving black marble of the grand mating hall, Lyra was enduring. The stone floor was freezing, biting through the thin, faded fabric of her gray servant's dress. Her knees were bruised, aching with a deep, throbbing rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. Yet her hands remained perfectly steady. Her long, platinum blonde hair was braided tightly against her skull, keeping her face exposed to the harsh, judgmental whispers of the courtiers gathered around them. "Look at the mute Omega," someone whispered from the first row of nobles. Fitting that she should be the one to hem the mistress's gown, the lowest of the pack serving the highest. Lyra heard them. She always heard them. But she did not raise her head. She kept her pale, silver-gray eyes fixed on the heavy, silver-threaded silk of Lady Vespera's gown. Her fingers moved with precise mechanical efficiency, pinning the delicate lace at the hem. She did not cry. She did not tremble. Her silence was not a defect, as the pack believed. Her silence was a fortress. It was the only way to hide the truth of her bloodline, a truth her mother had died to protect. Beneath the collar of her frayed dress, resting against the hollow of her collarbone, was a frost-glass pendant. It was cracked with age and cold to the touch. It was the seal that bound her scent, hiding the ancient white queen blood that flowed through her veins. As long as she wore it, she was just Lyra, the silent, invisible Omega. Above her, sitting upon the towering winter throne, was Alpha King Kaelin. His presence filled the massive hall, heavy and suffocating like an approaching blizzard. He wore a dark leather tunic draped with a silver wolf fur mantle. His face was a landscape of harsh, aristocratic angles, carved from duty and war. His piercing ice-blue eyes scanned the hall, commanding absolute submission without him having to speak a single word. He was choosing a mistress tonight. Lady Vespera, the daughter of his most powerful general. It was a calculated move, a political alliance meant to secure the eastern borders of the Winterclaw Kingdom. Kaelin did not believe in fated mates. He believed in power, in survival, in the cold, hard arithmetic of ruling the most ruthless pack in the north. But tonight, something was wrong. Kaelin shifted on his throne, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. Inside his chest, his wolf, a massive, battle-scarred creature of frost and shadow, was pacing. It was a frantic, agitated movement that Kaelin had not felt in years. The beast was scratching at the inside of his ribs, growling low in his mind, rejecting the very ceremony taking place. Kaelin frowned, his ice-blue eyes narrowing as they fell upon the small, fragile-looking servant girl kneeling at Vespera's feet. He did not know the girl's name. He only knew she was the mute Omega from the kitchens. But looking at her bowed head, at the sharp, elegant curve of her neck, a strange tightness gripped his throat. A bizarre, irrational urge washed over him, the urge to step down from his throne, pull her up from the freezing floor, and wrap his own mantle around her trembling shoulders. He forced the thought away. It was a momentary weakness, a distraction. "Make sure the hem does not drag on the stairs, Omega," Lady Vespera sneered, looking down at Lyra with eyes full of smug triumph. Vespera was beautiful, but it was a sharp, cruel kind of beauty. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted the entire court to see her dominance. She wanted to stand beside the Alpha King and remind everyone that she was untouchable. Lyra did not respond. She merely adjusted the last silver pin, smoothing the fabric with her cold, raw fingers. She was finished. She placed her hands flat on the frozen marble, preparing to push herself back and bow away into the shadows where she belonged. She just wanted to disappear. But Vespera was not satisfied with simple obedience. She wanted a display. As Lyra began to pull her hands back, Vespera deliberately shifted her weight. Her sharp, silver-tipped heel came down with brutal force directly onto Lyra's fingers. The pain was a sudden, blinding flash of white-hot agony. The impact forced Lyra forward, her chest colliding hard against the sharp edge of the stone step. She bit the inside of her cheek so fiercely that she tasted the metallic tang of her own blood. She did not scream. She swallowed the sound, locking her jaw, refusing to give Vespera the satisfaction of her pain. But as her chest hit the stone, a terrible, delicate sound echoed beneath her dress. Crack. It was a small sound, barely audible over the murmurs of the court, but to Lyra it sounded like a crumbling glacier. The frost glass pendant, pressed between her collarbone and the hard marble, had fractured. A single hairline crack split the ancient glass. In that exact fraction of a second, the air in the grand mating hall changed. The heavy scent of the burning torches and the expensive perfumes of the nobles was suddenly pierced by something else. Something impossible. It was a scent that carried the wild, untamed chill of the deep forest. Crushed pea in needles. The crisp, electric ozone of the very first winter snow. It was faint, slipping through the tiny crack in the glass, but it was pure, unadulterated, and overwhelmingly ancient. On the winter throne, Alpha King Kaelin's body went completely rigid. The air rushed from his lungs. His hands gripped the armrests of his throne with such force that the solid black stone groaned under the pressure. The ice blue of his eyes vanished, swallowed instantly by a blazing, molten gold. His wolf, which had been pacing in restless irritation, suddenly stopped. It stood at full attention in his mind, its hackles raised, its eyes fixed entirely on the kneeling girl in the frayed gray dress. Mine. The word did not come from Kaelin. It came from the deepest, most primal core of his soul. It was a possessive, terrifying roar that shook the very foundations of his control. Lyra slowly pulled her bruised, bleeding hand away from beneath Lady Vespera's silver-tipped heel. She did not cradle the injured fingers. She did not look up at the woman who had intentionally tried to crush them. Moving with a quiet, deliberate grace that defied her worn gray dress, she pushed herself up from the freezing marble floor. Her knees throbbed, trembling slightly under her weight, but her posture remained impeccably straight. She executed a perfect, silent bow toward the Alpha King, her eyes lowered to the base of his throne, and then she turned to leave the grand mating hall. On the dais, Lady Vespera's smile faltered. Her chest tightened with a sudden, petty fury. The mute Omega had not whimpered. She had not begged. There was an infuriating, untouchable dignity in the way the girl walked away, a silent resilience that made Vespera feel oddly small, even while standing next to the Alpha King. Insolent little creature, Vespera hissed under her breath. She wanted the Omega to break. She wanted the entire court to see her absolute supremacy before Kaelin officially placed the mistress's crown upon her head. As Lyra took her fourth step toward the heavy oak doors, Vespera stepped down from the dais. "I did not dismiss you, Omega!" Vespera's voice rang out, sharp and echoing against the high stone ceiling. Lyra stopped, but she did not turn around. Her breath hitched. Beneath her dress, The fractured frost glass pendant felt like a block of dry ice against her skin. The hairline crack had already let a sliver of her true scent slip out, and she could feel the perilous edge of her own sealed power shifting in her blood. She needed to get out. She needed to run before the seal gave way completely. But Vespera moved faster. Angered by the servant's lack of immediate submission, the noblewoman reached out and grabbed Lyra roughly by the shoulder, spinning her around. Vespera's hand snagged the frayed collar of Lyra's gray dress. Her manicured fingers caught the thin, worn cord hidden beneath the fabric. Lyra's silver-gray eyes widened in sheer panic. Her hands flew up, not to protect her face, but to guard her chest. "No," she mouthed silently, her first visible crack of emotion. It was too late. With a harsh, aggressive yank, Vespera tore the collar. The cord snapped. The cracked frost glass pendant was ripped from Lyra's neck. It flew through the air, catching the torchlight for one agonizing second before it hit the black marble floor. Shatter. The sound was sharp, like a crystal goblet breaking in a silent cathedral. The pendant burst into a dozen glittering shards, scattering across the dark stone. For one heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then, the seal broke entirely. It was not a gradual release, it was an explosion, an invisible, suffocating tidal wave of pure, unfiltered scent slammed into the grand mating hall. The heavy smell of burning torches and noble perfumes was instantly annihilated. In its place was the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of crushed pine, deep winter woods, and the sharp, breathtaking bite of the very first snow. Simultaneously, the temperature in the massive hall plummeted. Frost began to creep across the black marble tiles, radiating outward from the shattered glass at Lyra's feet. The torches lining the walls flickered wildly, their flames turning a strange, pale blue. Lyra stood frozen, her blood running cold. Her chest heaved, her true scent pouring from her in relentless waves. The secret she had carried for 21 years, the White Queen bloodline her mother had died to conceal, was out in the open. A terrifying, deafening sound shattered the stunned silence of the court. It was a snarl, but it was not a human sound. It was the deep, guttural, earth-shaking roar of a predator pushed over the edge of sanity. Everyone turned toward the winter throne. Alpha King Kalen was no longer sitting. He stood at the edge of the dais, his massive frame vibrating with a primal, barely contained violence. The dignified, cold ruler was gone. The beast had taken the surface. His skin was pale, his jaw locked in a rictus of desperate possession, and his eyes, normally a piercing ice blue, were burning with a solid, blinding gold. His wolf had caught the scent, the true scent, the only scent: mate. The bond, hidden for years beneath a glass seal, snapped into place with the force of a falling guillotine. It hit Kalen so hard he physically staggered, his hands gripping his head as the scent of pine and snow rushed into his lungs, rewriting his entire existence in a single breath. The political alliance, the Mistress ceremony, the council's demands, all of it was reduced to ash in the face of the mate bond. "My king," Vespera stammered, stepping toward him, her face pale with confusion. She reached out to touch his arm. "What is—" "Do not tea! Ouch me!" Kalen's voice was a thunderclap that shook dust from the rafters. The sheer force of his alpha aura slammed into the room, driving half the nobles to their knees in immediate, suffocating submission. Vespera gasped, stumbling backward as if physically struck, her beautiful gown tangling around her legs. Kaelin didn't even look at her. His glowing golden eyes were locked with deadly, singular focus on the fragile girl in the torn gray dress standing over the shattered glass. He vaulted down the stone steps of the dais, his boots hitting the floor with heavy, predatory thuds, moving toward the silent Omega with the terrifying speed of a wolf hunting down its heart. The Alpha King was moving, and the court of Winterclaw scattered like frightened prey. Kaelin descended the obsidian steps of the dais, his boots hitting the stone with a heavy, lethal urgency. The massive, suffocating pressure of his aura flooded the grand mating hall, pressing the air from the lungs of the nobility. He was no longer a king conducting a political ceremony. He was a beast, driven by a single, agonizing command: mate. But Lyra did not wait for him. The moment the pendant shattered and Kaelin's golden eyes locked onto hers, pure, visceral terror flooded her veins. For 21 years, she had been taught that her White Queen blood was a death sentence. The Winterclaw pack despised weakness, but they feared ancient magi even more. If the council realized what she truly was, what the scent of crushed pine and winter snow meant, they would not revere her, they would chain her. She did not freeze in awe of the Alpha King. She spun on her heel, her frayed gray dress whipping around her ankles, and ran. She darted past the stunned guards at the entrance, her small frame slipping through the heavy oak doors just before they could register the chaos unfolding inside. "Stop!" a voice roared behind her, a command so powerful it made the stone walls vibrate. But Lyra kept running, her bare hands pushing against the freezing stone of the outer corridors. She plunged into the dimly lit, labyrinthine servant passageways of the ice-stone palace, her breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. With every step she took, the magic she had suppressed for a lifetime bled freely from her skin. A thin, delicate layer of white frost bloomed across the walls and the floorboards in her wake, turning the corridor into a frozen tunnel. Back in the grand mating hall, Kaelin reached the spot where she had been kneeling. He did not shout for his guards to chase her. He did not issue a royal decree. To the absolute horror of the 500 nobles watching, the ruthless Alpha King of Winterclaw dropped to his knees on the black marble floor. His large, scarred hands hovered over the shattered remains of the frost glass pendant. He reached down and picked up the largest shard. The sharp edge bit into his thick skin, but he did not feel it. What he felt was the devastating, intoxicating scent radiating from the glass. It bypassed his logic, bypassed his pride, and anchored itself directly into his soul. Then his golden eyes caught it. On the edge of the broken glass there was a smear of crimson. Blood. Kaelin's breath hitched. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. Just moments ago, he had sat on his throne and watched Lady Vespera drive her silver-tipped heel into the small, fragile hands of a kneeling servant. He had watched it happen. He had allowed it to happen, dismissing the girl as a silent nobody, an acceptable casualty of court politics. The guilt was instantaneous and corrosive. The beast inside him howled in agony, thrashing against his ribs, demanding blood in retribution for its wounded mate. His mate. The girl with the pale hair and the bruised knees. The girl who had endured public humiliation in absolute, dignified silence to prepare another woman for his throne. Kaelin? The voice was sharp, trembling with a mixture of fear and furious indignation. Lady Vespera had recovered her footing and marched down the steps of the dais, her silk gown trailing behind her. She looked at the king kneeling on the floor over a piece of trash, and her face contorted with disgust. "What are you doing?" Vespera demanded, trying to project the authority of a mistress she had not yet been crowned. "The ceremony is not finished. You are humiliating me in front of the council over some clumsy, mute omega." "Silence!" Kalen did not yell. He did not even raise his voice. He spoke the word with a low, vibrating deadliness that chilled the marrow in the bones of everyone present. He slowly rose to his feet. When he turned to look at Vespera, his eyes were no longer ice blue. They were the molten, unnatural gold of an alpha pushed to the absolute brink of violence. The air around him seemed to warp with the sheer density of his power. Vespera took a step back, her confidence shattering. The beautiful, cruel noblewoman suddenly realized she was not looking at her future husband. She was looking at a predator calculating how quickly it could tear her throat out. "If you speak another word," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, monstrous whisper, "if you take one step toward that door, I will execute you where you stand, and I will burn your father's estate to the ground." Vespera's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She trembled, shrinking back against the stone steps, her face draining of all color. The entire court held its breath. No one dared to move. Kalen turned his gaze to his beta, a heavily scarred warrior standing near the entrance. "Lock down the palace," Kalen ordered, his tone clipping with military precision. "Seal the gates. Drop the iron portcullis. No one leaves this hall. If a single noble tries to exit, break the ear legs." "Yes, my king," the beta responded instantly, barking orders to the royal guard. The heavy oak doors were pulled shut, and the sound of iron deadbolts sliding into place echoed like a death knell. Kalen did not look back at the throne. He did not look at the mistress's crown resting on the velvet cushion. He turned and strode toward the side exit, following the path the girl had taken. As he stepped into the dark corridor, his wolf whined eagerly in his mind. The scent of crushed pine and winter snow was a heavy, invisible ribbon pulling him forward. But there was something else. Kalen looked down at the stone floor. A trail of delicate, luminous frost coated the black marble, glowing faintly in the torchlight. The freezing magic was spreading upward along the walls, leaving beautiful, crystalline patterns in the shape of wolf paws and winter leaves. His silent omega was not just a servant. Kalen's jaw tightened. He tracked the trail of frost deeper into the labyrinth of the palace, his heart pounding a frantic, relentless rhythm. The frost was leading away from the servant quarters, winding upward through the spiraling stone stairs toward the coldest, most isolated part of the fortress, the abandoned northern watchtower. The abandoned northern watchtower was the highest and coldest point in the ice stone palace. Wind howled through the cracked stone walls, driving bitter snow through the unglazed window. W.S. For years, no one had set foot in this desolate spire, but tonight it was Lyra's only sanctuary. She burst through the heavy oak door, slamming it shut behind her and dropping the rusted iron bar into place. Her chest heaved, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She pressed her back against the thick wood, sliding down until she hit the stone floor. Her knees, already bruised and raw, screamed in protest, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the violent tempest raging inside her blood. Without the frost glass pendant, her body was no longer her own. The ancient White Queen magic, suppressed for over 2 decades, was tearing through her veins with the force of an avalanche. She looked down at her trembling hands. Her pale skin was glowing with a faint, ethereal silver light. Ice crystals were forming on her fingertips, spreading rapidly up her arms. Where her frayed gray dress brushed the floor, the stone instantly froze. A layer of thick, crystalline ice erupted across the watchtower, crawling up the circular walls, encasing the ancient stonework in a blindingly white, diamond-hard shell. The temperature in the room plummeted to an unnatural, lethal degree. She was losing control. The silence she had carefully maintained her entire life was breaking, not with words, but with a catastrophic release of winter magic. Suddenly, a heavy metallic thud hit the oak door behind her. Lyra scrambled away, slipping slightly on the ice she had just created. Through the thick wood she could hear the muffled sound of a blade being wedged into the doorframe. "Open the door, Omega!" A cruel, muffled voice rasped from the corridor. It was one of Lady Vespera's personal shadow guards. He must have been stationed in the upper corridors and seen her flee, acting on standing orders to eliminate any threat to his mistress's ascension. The guard kicked the door. The rusted iron bar groaned, bending under the force of a fully trained wolf warrior. Lyra backed away until her spine hit the icy wall opposite the door. There was nowhere left to run. Behind her was a sheer drop from the watchtower window into the jagged, snow-covered cliffs of the kingdom's outer wall. In front of her was a trained killer. Crack! The iron bar snapped. The heavy oak door flew open, shattering the ice that had started to seal it shut. The shadow guard stepped into the room, a cruel, serrated steel blade in his hand. He paused, his breath catching as the unnatural, biting cold of the room hit him. He looked at the frost-covered walls, then at the fragile girl in the torn servant's dress. He didn't understand the magic, but he didn't care. His orders were absolute. "You should have stayed on your knees," the guard sneered, raising his blade. Lyra did not cower. She did not cover her face or squeeze her eyes shut in anticipation of the strike. The years of swallowing her pride, of biting her tongue, of bowing to people who were entirely beneath her bloodline's worth, it all evaporated in the freezing air. As the guard lunged forward, Lyra raised her bare, bruised hand. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her pale, silver-gray eyes flashed with a blinding, luminescent white light. A shockwave of absolute zero burst from her palm. It hit the guard mid-stride. He didn't freeze completely, but the magic slammed into his serrated steel blade. The temperature of the metal dropped so fast and so violently that the structural integrity of the steel simply failed. With a sound like a shattering mirror, the guard's sword exploded into 1,000 harmless frozen fragments. The guard staggered back, staring at his empty hilt in sheer, unadulterated horror. He looked up at Lyra, realizing too late that he had not cornered a helpless servant. He had cornered a force of nature. Taking advantage of his shock, Lyra didn't wait to see if he would attack again. She spun around, leaping onto the stone sill of the arched window. The blizzard outside was a swirling vortex of white, a deadly drop into the frozen unknown. But the storm was her element. The storm was safer than the palace. Without a second thought, she threw herself out of the window, disappearing into the howling blizzard. Seconds later, a massive, terrifying force collided with the watchtower door. Alpha King Kalen tore through the entrance, moving with such predatory speed that the remaining wood of the doorframe splintered into dust. His golden eyes swept the room, his chest heaving, his dark leather tunic dusted with the frost he had tracked through the corridors. He saw the shadow guard trembling on the floor, clutching a broken, frozen hilt. But Kaelin's gaze instantly bypassed the pathetic assassin. He looked at the room. The entire watchtower was transformed into an ancient, glittering ice cave. The scent of crushed pine and winter snow was so overwhelmingly thick here that it made his wolf whine with desperate longing. Kaelin stalked forward, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen floor. He grabbed the terrified guard by the throat, lifting the grown man off the ground with one hand. Alpha King Kaelin strode into the room. He was a terrifying sight. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with melting snow, and his ice-blue eyes had not fully returned. They still flickered with the dangerous, unstable gold of his beast. In his right hand, he dragged the half-frozen shadow guard he had found in the watchtower. With a careless flick of his wrist, Kaelin threw the assassin across the black marble floor. The man slid and crashed violently against the base of the dais, groaning in pain. Vespera gasped, taking a sharp step backward. She recognized her personal guard. "My king," the High Elder stepped forward, trying to project authority. "We have concluded that the mute Omega is a practitioner of dark magic. She has cast a spell upon your mind. We must send the royal hunters to... If a single hunter leaves this fortress, I will personally mount their head on the palace gates." Kaelin interrupted. His voice was not a shout, but it carried a deadly, absolute finality that echoed in the cavernous room. He walked up the steps of the dais and stopped in front of the velvet cushion. Resting upon it was the silver mistress's crown, glittering with diamonds, waiting to be placed on Vespera's head. "Kaelin," Vespera pleaded, her voice taking on a desperate, sweet edge. "She attacked my guard. She destroyed the watchtower with ice. You saw it yourself. She is a monster. We must finish the ceremony, our alliance." "There is no alliance," Kaelin said coldly. He picked up the silver crown. "She is not a witch," the Alpha King declared, turning to face the 500 nobles. He did not hide behind political excuses. He did not try to save his own pride. "She is the last of the White Queen bloodline, and she is my fated mate." A heavy, suffocated silence fell over the court. The revelation struck the nobility like a physical blow. A White Queen. The ancient, revered bloodline that had been thought extinct for centuries, hiding in plain sight, scrubbing their floors, mending their clothes. "My king, be reasonable," the High Elder sputtered, his face flushing red. "Even if fate claims her, she is a mute servant. She has no political backing, no army. You are the Alpha King of Winterclaw. You cannot afford to throw away a military alliance for a peasant girl." Kaelin looked down at the silver crown in his hands. "I let her kneel on this frozen stone," Kaelin said, his voice dropping into a harsh, self-loathing rasp that made the council flinch. "I sat on this throne, blinded by duty and arrogance, and allowed a coward to crush her hands." His golden eyes snapped toward Vespera, who withered under the sheer hatred in his gaze. "My blindness is my own sin," Kaelin continued, his voice rising, vibrating with the devastating power of his alpha aura. "And I will bear the political consequences of it. I will answer to the gods for failing to recognize her, but her humiliation ends tonight." With a sudden, violent flex of his powerful hands, Kaelin crushed the mistress's crown. The thick silver warped and snapped. The diamonds popped from their settings, raining down onto the marble floor like frozen tears. Vespera let out a short, terrified scream as Kaelin dropped the ruined lump of metal at her feet. "The mute Omega is the true Luna of Winterclaw," Kaelin commanded, his words carving themselves into the history of the pack. "Mobilize the entire army. Form a perimeter 10 miles deep around the mountain pass. You will not hunt her. You will guard the borders so the storm does not claim her." He stepped down from the dais, his aura pressing against the room so heavily that several guards fell to their knees. "And hear this clearly," Kaelin growled, his golden eyes scanning the terrified faces of the council and the trembling Mistress. "If anyone speaks a word against her, if anyone dares to raise a weapon, or if a single hair on her head is harmed, you will not face a trial, you will face me, and you will pay with the blood of your entire house." The outer gates of the Winterclaw kingdom were forged from solid black iron, towering 50 feet into the sky. They were designed to keep the harshness of the wild out, but tonight they stood as the final barrier keeping Lyra trapped inside. The blizzard was a deafening roar around her. The wind whipped her platinum blonde hair across her face and tore at the fragile fabric of her gray servant's dress. Her bare feet moved steadily through the knee-deep snow. To any ordinary wolf, the temperature would have been a swift and merciless death. But to Lyra, the cold was merely a heavy blanket, a physical manifestation of the White Queen magic that was finally breathing free after 21 years of suppression. She was exhausted. The sudden release of the seal had drained her physical strength, leaving her muscles aching and her breathing shallow. But she did not stop. The massive iron gates were only 100 yards away. If she could just pass through the archway, she could disappear into the jagged northern mountains where no royal tracker could ever follow. She took another step, her pale, silver-gray eyes fixed on the iron bars. Suddenly, the shadows beneath the gatehouse detached themselves from the darkness. Torches flared to life, their flames burning violently in the wind. A dozen heavily armored soldiers stepped into the falling snow, blocking the exit. They did not wear the silver wolf crest of the Alpha King. They wore the black falcon insignia of General Kael, Lady Vespera's father. Lyra halted, her breath plumed in the freezing air. The captain of the guard, a massive, battle-scarred man wrapped in thick furs, stepped forward. He drew a heavy broadsword, the steel singing a lethal note over the howling wind. Vespera's father controlled the outer garrison, and word had clearly traveled faster than the Alpha King's lockdown orders. The Mistress had sent a final, desperate command: eliminate the threat before Kaelin could reach her. "Hold your ground, witch!" the captain barked, his voice rough and completely devoid of mercy. "General's orders. A heretic Omega has used dark arts to bewitch the Alpha King and sabotage the mating ceremony." The soldiers fanned out, forming a deadly semicircle around her. They held their weapons ready, their eyes narrowed against the biting snow. They looked at her not as a wolf, not as a woman, but as a rabid animal that needed to be put down for the good of the realm. Lyra did not retreat. She stood alone in the center of the frozen courtyard, a frail figure in a torn dress, surrounded by heavily armed killers. "You don't look like much of a witch," the captain sneered, stepping closer. He looked at her bare feet, at the bruises blooming on her exposed skin. "Just a pathetic, mute servant trying to punch above her weight. You should have stayed in the kitchens, Omega." He raised his broadsword, pointing the heavy steel tip directly at her chest. "On your knees," the captain commanded. Bow your head and accept a traitor's execution, and I will make it quick. On your knees. The words echoed in Lyra's mind, cutting through the roar of the blizzard. How many times in her life had she heard that command? How many times had she bowed her head, scrubbed the floors, and swallowed her voice to survive? Just hours ago, she had knelt on the freezing black marble of the grand mating hall. She had let Vespera crush her fingers. She had let the Alpha King look right through her, treating her like a piece of invisible furniture. She had compromised her dignity for survival, and it had brought her exactly here, standing in the snow, waiting to be butchered. Lyra slowly lowered her gaze to the heavy steel blade pointed at her heart. Then she looked up, her pale silver-gray eyes meeting the captain's harsh stare. She did not kneel. She straightened her spine, her posture transforming from a weary fugitive into something impossibly regal. She raised her chin, her eyes flashing with a cold, untouchable defiance. She did not speak a single word, but her absolute refusal was louder than any scream. She was a daughter of the ancient White Queens. If she was going to die tonight, she would die standing. The captain's face contorted with sudden, irrational fury. The silent arrogance of the frail girl infuriated him. It made a mockery of his armor, his weapon, and his authority. "Have it your way, you arrogant little bitch," he growled. He lunged forward, swinging the heavy broadsword in a brutal, sweeping arc aimed directly at her neck. Lyra did not flinch. She did not raise her hands to beg for mercy. She simply stood her ground, her eyes wide and fearless, accepting the consequence of her own unyielding pride. The blade slashed through the freezing air, but the wind, heavy with Lyra's erratic magic, pushed back. The invisible force slowed the captain's strike just enough to throw off his aim. The heavy steel missed her neck, instead slicing cleanly through the thin fabric of her gray dress and biting into the flesh of her shoulder. It was a shallow cut, but the pain flared hot and sharp against the freezing cold. Lyra gasped silently, her body jolting backward from the impact. A single bright drop of crimson blood fell from her shoulder. It fell through the howling wind. It seemed to fall in agonizing slow motion, a bead of perfect royal red against the overwhelming white of the storm. It hit the pristine, untouched snow at her feet. The exact second the White Queen's blood touched the earth, the world simply stopped. The howling wind died instantly. The falling snow froze in midair, suspended like a million tiny diamonds. The captain of the guard froze mid-swing, his eyes widening in sudden, paralyzing terror as the temperature plummeted so violently that the steel of his sword began to groan. Then, the earth beneath the snow rippled. A deafening subterranean crack echoed across the courtyard. The ancient winter magic, dormant in the bedrock of the Winterclaw Mountains for centuries, answered the blood of its true sovereign. The blizzard did not just resume, it detonated. A colossal, blinding vortex of pure, luminous white energy erupted from the drop of blood, spiraling upward and swallowing the iron gates, the guards, and the silent New Huang into a maelstrom of absolute, devastating power. The explosion of White Queen magic did not tear the courtyard apart with fire or concussive force. It was far more elegant and far more terrifying. A dome of absolute luminous frost expanded outward from the single drop of Lyra's blood. It swept over the captain of the guard and his soldiers in a heartbeat. The heavy broadsword that had struck her shoulder clattered to the ground, brittle and useless. The guards were not killed, but they were instantly encased in a thick shell of impenetrable diamond-hard ice, frozen mid-stride like statues in a forgotten winter garden. At the epicenter of the magical cyclone, Lyra stood suspended in the blinding white lie, her frayed gray dress whipped violently in the magical wind. Her platinum blonde hair floated around her like a halo of spun silver. The wound on her shoulder had stopped bleeding, the crimson sealed by a delicate layer of frost. She was magnificent, a physical embodiment of the ancient winter gods the pack had long since stopped worshipping. But the power was too much. For 21 years her body had been starved, forced into the subservient role of a mute omega. Channeling the raw, tectonic energy of the bedrock was tearing at her fragile mortal frame. The blinding light in her silver-gray eyes flickered. Her knees, already heavily bruised from the grand mating hall, finally buckled. She began to fall. But she did not hit the frozen ground. A massive shadow tore through the wall of the blizzard. The frost-gray wolf, huge and battle-scarred, lunged into the epicenter of the magical storm. The beast did not hesitate, did not flinch against the biting, absolute zero temperatures radiating from her skin. The wolf caught her, his massive, fur-covered body acting as a living cushion between her and the ice. Instantly, the wolf shifted. Kaelin caught her in his arms, his human skin burning with the supernatural heat of a shifting alpha. He dropped to his knees in the snow, pulling her small, freezing body hard against his broad chest. He didn't issue a command. He didn't roar. With frantic, desperate tenderness, he unclasped the heavy silver wolf fur mantle from his own shoulders and wrapped it tightly around her trembling frame, burying her in his warmth and his scent.
You are safe.
"I have you," Kaelin choked out, his voice raw, vibrating with a terror he had never known on any battlefield. "I have you. Let it go. You are safe."
But why?
Lyra's breath hitched in her throat. The overpowering scent of him, leather, rain, and the deep musk of a protective alpha, crashed into her senses, perfectly intertwining with her own scent of crushed pine and snow. The mate bond, which she had tried to ruthlessly suppress, anchored itself into her soul. It did not demand submission. It offered a shield. Sensing the stabilizing presence of her alpha, the chaotic winter magic began to recede. The howling vortex collapsed into a gentle, swirling snowfall. The blinding light faded from Lyra's eyes, returning them to their soft, pale silver gray. She looked up at the man holding her. Kaelin's face was inches from hers. The ruthless king of Winterclaw, the man who was supposed to be crowning his mistress right now, was looking at her with a devotion so profound it bordered on madness. His golden eyes tracked the shallow, frost-sealed cut on her shoulder, and his jaw locked with a murderous intensity. Lyra raised her bruised hand, her fingers brushing against the cold leather of his tunic. She did not speak, but her eyes asked the question she had guarded her whole life. "Will you hide me, or will you chain me?" Kaelin understood the silent question perfectly. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "I will burn the world before I let anyone make you kneel again," he whispered, a sacred vow sealed in the snow. "You are my Luna. You are my queen." He gathered her effortlessly into his arms, standing up with her secured against his chest. The guards remained frozen in their icy prisons, paralyzed by the ancient magic. Kaelin ignored them. They were pawns. He was going after the masters. The walk back to the ice stone palace was silent, save for the crunch of Kaelin's boots in the snow. Lyra rested her head against his shoulder, buried in his heavy fur mantle. The exhaustion of the magical outburst pulled at her consciousness, but she kept her eyes open. She needed to see this end. Back in the grand mating hall, the tension had reached a breaking point. Lady Vespera paced nervously near the dais, the crushed remains of the silver mistress's crown still lying on the black marble floor. The High Elder and the Council were whispering furiously, trying to formulate a plan to salvage the alliance and control their erratic king. The heavy iron doors at the front of the hall did not just open. They were kicked inward with such devastating force that the iron hinges screamed. 500 nobles gasped, scrambling backward as Alpha King Kalen strode back into the hall. He was entirely drenched in snow, his dark leather tunic wet, his eyes blazing with the golden fire of an unyielding beast. But it was what he carried that made the entire court freeze in absolute, breathless shock. Wrapped in the king's own royal mantle was the mute Omega. Her pale hair cascaded over Kalen's arm. Beneath the heavy fur, the torn, blood-stained collar of her gray servant's dress was visible. The faint, undeniable scent of crushed pine and winter snow radiated from her, intermingled perfectly with the commanding